Hello everyone and welcome to the latest in the Coffee Break webinar series from Squared Up. My name's Richard Benwell, founder and product architect here at Squared Up, and I'm joined today with Matthew Long.
Hey Richard, how's it going?
Yeah, good, thanks. Right, so today's topic is going to be focusing on integrating System Center Service Manager into our dashboard. So you've sort of prepped some content here, Matthew. Is this going to be just of interest to people who have System Center Service Manager?
No, we're using the SQL Tile in Squared Up to be able to actually integrate our Service Manager data in. And that's applicable to anyone who has a SQL data source somewhere that they'd like to bring that information into Squared Up, whether that's another ITSM product perhaps, or just another monitoring product or something else that has data of interest. So hopefully it should be useful for everyone.
And if customers have something like ServiceNow or one of the other ITSM tools, are the principles still roughly the same?
Yeah, nothing we're showing here involves custom CMDB classes or anything like that. Everything has the columns we're showing and the properties we're showing. So it should be relevant to anyone, certainly spark the imagination of what you could do.
All right, great. Let's crack on then. What do you have in store for us today?
So just advanced slides. So first thing we do is a very, very quick cap on why having ITSM data in Squared Up is actually useful. Then we'll take a look at the SQL tile, what it can actually do and how we can configure it, and touch on a couple of the sort of considerations that you should think about when configuring permissions to be able to use it. And then we'll actually dive into using that directly to query some data from the Service Manager databases. There are actually two DBs for Service Manager, much like SCOM. There's sort of a live product database where the consoles are all powered from, and there's also a data warehouse that's used for reporting purposes, and there are some differences if you report and point Squared Up at those two databases, so I want to touch on which one you should use and make sure you're using the right one for your needs. And then lastly, we'll be looking at some actual dashboards that you can create using some sample queries that we published online as well, so everyone can leverage that and get started straight away.
All right, okay, so look forward to seeing some SQL magic later on in the demos.
Yep, should be fun. Okay, so the first thing basically is why do we actually want to bring ITSM data into Squared Up in the first place? And ITSM is a very hot term. People are talking about we need to think about this as a service portfolio. Well, what does that actually mean? Well, for people who are working in monitoring, your job is to keep everything running and healthy. The reason it's valuable is because it addresses three big problems, which is the first one: your monitoring, no matter how perfect, is going to have blind spots. Sometimes there's that case where the monitoring says the app's up and fine, but users are reporting problems. And having a tile, having some visibility in Squared Up that there are some issues right now helps you cover off some of those monitoring blind spots. Or perhaps you can see something's red, but you're not really getting any detail as to why. But an incident that users reported is immediately lends you towards, oh, actually, if they're saying that this part of the component's broken, it's probably this problem over here.
So SCOM might be showing green on a particular server or an application, but you've got sort of a number of service desk tickets coming in, and obviously it's not green from the user point of view. Yeah.
Exactly, or maybe the monitoring is in place for that, but the monitoring's just a lot slower than the users reporting it, so you have a bit more early warning. The other thing, of course, is that downtime is often caused by changes. So if you can then surface sort of what's actually changed recently on this system, then you can understand immediately, okay, is this change likely to have caused this problem? And perhaps I need to look at what the change actually did and the implementation plan, the rollback plan for that. Or actually, this is a witch hunt. These changes are completely unrelated to the problem that's happening right now. We need to focus on something else instead. And also having awareness of recently resolved problems might also be helpful. If you think about organizations where you've got stack administrators where our job is just to keep the OS healthy and then you manage the application on top of that. If the OS recently had a fault that's been resolved and now the application is showing a fault, it might be different engineers who work on that who don't necessarily have visibility of the same queues. So being able to see, okay, actually this server recently had some problems that although they have been resolved, we can see those recent tickets might now help us troubleshoot actually some follow-up steps that we need to complete that the original engineer couldn't do.
So I guess lots of good use cases. At a high level, certainly a trend we're seeing with our customers is a lot of investment and interest in IT service management at the moment, not just Service Manager, other service management tools like ServiceNow. IT organizations are very much focused on getting service management into shape. And I guess this is a good example of how you can demonstrate sort of the relevancy of your SCOM monitoring alongside that investment into service management. So making sure your organization is not just focusing on service management and forgetting the investments you've made in SCOM, but bringing those investments in SCOM alongside that sort of service management solution as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about why do it. Let's actually get to the point of making this a reality. So to do this, we're going to leverage the SQL tile, which is a great little tile in Squared Up that basically allows you to display tabular or scalar data in any dashboard or perspective you like, as long as it's inside a Microsoft SQL database. So tabular means, rows and columns, and scalar means I want to just have like a roll up. It's like total count of incidents or something like that. Now there are a couple of things that are important to bear in mind. As I said, it works on dashboards and perspectives. A couple of differences on perspectives, and we'll talk about this if we have time. If not, that'll be next week. A key point with this is that the SQL Tile runs its queries using the squared up application pool identity if you're using integrated auth. So if you're not using SQL credentials, it's not going to execute the query as the user viewing the dashboard. It's going to run as a generic squared up identity, in this case the app pool ID. And as a point on that, please don't use SQL credentials for this, because if you do, you're embedding those in the connection string, and the connection string is just in the tile configuration, so anyone can now see the username and password there. So in order to get this to work, you're going to need to be able to realistically use integrated auth, so Windows auth with SQL, and put the squared up app pool ID or service account as a member on that database. The second thing I really want to highlight with the SQL Tile is that whatever query the dashboard author, the squared up admin, configures, squared up is just going to run. So there's no sort of safeguards in place to make sure that this query is just reading data, or that it isn't going to lock a whole bunch of very important tables while it's doing that, or cause performance problems. So you kind of need to be quite careful with this from a squared up admin perspective. Like, there's a permission called construct sensitive queries. Don't give this to all of your users, because what you're basically saying now is any user can plug in a connection string and a query and now have squared up execute that. So be careful with that privilege. And also, when you're requesting access for squared up into like these client databases, really do request minimum rights. Like, if you only want to do a query on a particular table, just have permission for that individual table, and make sure you've got read access only. Like, if you say, oh, the squared up app pool is now a sysadmin on all databases, and someone has the ability to put a sensitive query in there and run it, that could be problematic for you.
So taking this advice and applying it to Service Manager. So there's someone sitting on this call, on this webinar, and they want to get this set up with Service Manager. They would go to the Service Manager database. They would add the squared up service account, the app pool identity, which is by default network service. So it's the computer account.
It's the computer account, yeah.
Or if you've set it up as a domain account, it's that specific domain account. So that account needs the permissions on your Service Manager databases. And you're saying best practice is, don't just give them sysadmin rights. Kind of make sure that account just has read-only rights, ideally on just the tables and the views you'll be querying, because you really want to just kind of limit the exposure of the kind of squared up privileges. And then that sort of second bullet point there is saying essentially what you've done is given squared up the rights to read all of that data, but you want to constrain that further by saying only administrators of squared up can then construct those queries that's going to use that identity. So just some, I guess, kind of cautions around sort of security best practices before you start opening up your Service Manager database to anyone who has access to squared up. Right,
exactly. If it's just you, it's fine. But if you're going to say now, like, anyone can create a dashboard and anyone has this right, it's like, actually, do you trust everyone in your organization? Maybe you don't. But
just to be clear, like, by default, only SCOM administrators do have the right to build dashboards and put in arbitrary SQL queries. So sort of by default, you're on sort of safe ground, but it's worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's the SQL Tile. We've talked about capabilities. Let's actually go and have a look at it in products. So if I jump to, here we go, squared up. So I've already started actually building a dashboard. Sort of in progress on that one, so I'll show you what I've got so far. And basically this is quite a simple top level dashboard that just shows an overview of incidents and changes currently in the organization. So as you can see here, we've got scalar tiles over on the left, which are going to show the number of incidents reported in the last, in this case, 120 days. Not a lot going on in our environment, everything's up, which is great. And then the changes raised as well. And we've got then the table versions of the SQL Tile here showing, actually listing out the incidents with the IDs, titles when they're raised, and their impact and affected users. And again, we mentioned like how applicable is this to other products. Like, these columns and this kind of capability is pretty much available in every ITSM product. So there's nothing here necessarily that's specific to Service Manager. But I mean, anyone looking at this hopefully can immediately get an idea of how this could be useful. Now, if I come in the morning and I want to see a view of what's going on in the organization, I don't need to go and fire up a separate tool. I can do everything here from a single pane of glass and squared up. And certainly you could start constraining the SQL queries we've got here are very broad. They're showing all incidents, but you could very quickly start showing only incidents for a certain team or for a certain application.
So this is a regular squared up dashboard, but in this case, all of the data on this dashboard is coming from Service Manager and not from SCOM. In fact, there's no SCOM data on that dashboard at all, but you could mix and match if you wanted to, right?
Absolutely.
You could have health state from SCOM and tickets from Service Manager if you wanted to do that. Okay, right. So let's have a look at.
So let's actually configure a tile. So you notice that I've got a list of the number of incidents reported and then open incidents, but I haven't done the same for changes. So let's add in a SQL tile, and I'll show you that for actually how we could then pull back all the changes that are currently open. So I'm going to add a tile in here. Let's call this open changes. So when I click SQL for the SQL tile, the more recent versions of Squared Up, we've now created this sort of categories listing here. So now I get asked, do I want to have scalar, which is a single value, or do I want to have a table, which is going to show me tabular data? In this case, I want a table because I want to see all the incident details. Now it's going to ask me for a connection string here, which is basically how I'm actually going to connect into this database. So every tile will prompt for this connection string repeatedly. Now, to save me actually typing this out, I already have SQL open over here and my connection string written in, so I'm going to copy and paste this. But this is basically the kind of thing you can ask your app owner or SQL admin for. Basically, the data source is the SQL instance name, so the SQL server and instance name, and then the initial catalog is the database it's going to connect to, which in this case here is the data warehouse data mart for Service Manager. And then integrated security true just means use Windows Auth, which will then connect using this account.
Can we configure that centrally anywhere, or do we do that per tile at the moment?
It has to be per tile at the moment, but we are looking at, in the future product update, making that something that you actually configure centrally, kind of like you do Web API today as well. Okay, so that's that done. So again, if you look a bit scary, ask your SQL admin or your app owner for the connection string. Or actually, if you, funnily enough, if you go and look in SCOM for the database, there's a connection string property already on there. So you can just grab that and use that. The next thing you need now to provide basically is the query that you want to run. And this is, at this point, it's a SQL query. There's nothing special to Squared Up at this point. So the piece of advice I'd give you is write your query first inside like your SQL tool of choice. In this case, this is just SQL Server Manager. So I'm going to just run my query and make sure it works. There we go. So that's pretty simple here. Only one open right now. Now, the key point here is this is just Service Manager schema, right? So at this point, I need to have a bit of knowledge about the system I'm integrating with. Like if I'm just a Squared Up SCOM guy, maybe I need to go and talk to a SME on, in this case, Service Manager and say, look, this is what I want to show. Do you know the right views? Do you know the right fields to go and look at? There is actually documentation online, which we'll include some links to in the show notes, on the Service Manager data warehouse schema, so you can actually look at that to get a sense of where everything's being stored. But this is pretty typical fields: get the ID, the title, the status name, which is typically stored in ITSM products and it is in Service Manager too as like a number. So like status 43, what does that actually mean? Well, that translates to the in progress status. So that's what we're selecting there. And then we're going to massage the date as well. Dates in Service Manager are stored in UTC, regardless of what time zone you're in. So here we're going to take that date and display it in a nice friendly, in this case, European format, which is what 113 is. So again, these sort of sample queries are samples. You'll need to look at these and look at your use case. Like if you're, I don't know, in Tupelo, Mississippi, and you're in 6 hours behind GMT, you might want to modify this so that actually the time zone shown isn't UTC, it's local to you or something like that.
And just for kind of people on the webinar or watching the recording, that looks like a useful query. Is there anywhere we can get sort of started quickly with some queries to get us going?
Yep, so we've on our GitHub repository on the scripts project, there is an integration samples folder here, and you've got sample queries for both the data warehouse and the CMDB.
Great.
And I'll talk about why we've got 2 different sets of versions there a bit later on. So we see that our query works, so we get the data we like here. So now I'm going to grab that and go over to my Squared Up thing here, drop in my query, and boom, there we go. You can see that it just displays exactly the same. Now, if I don't like the order of the columns, I can just change that in the query, and likewise I've used the as SQL statement here to change the display names. So rather than having like status string display name, which would be an awful thing to have, I just called it status. So by changing the query, you can actually modify what the table looked like. If you just did select star, you know, we'd get like 30 or 40 columns here and it wouldn't look great. And likewise with the dates, if I haven't modified the date here to turn it into a string value, Squared Up's going to display that as just a numeric Unix timestamp because that's what the date actually looks like. And the SQL Management Studio is normally doing that for you.
But the guidance is get things looking the way you want them to look in SQL Server Management Studio. So get the right results and then just copy and paste the query in.
9 times out of 10, it'll come out perfectly here.
Yep.
So let me hit done on that, and there we go. Now we have open changes. Let me just drag that up here. Ooh. There we go. So now it looks quite nice, and that was pretty easy, assuming I know the SQL query, and that is always the sort of asterisk with integrating with anything, as long as you know what you're integrating with.
Just going back to that kind of query, you were talking about the select statement there. You're essentially picking out the columns using the SQL select.
Yeah.
I assume things like ordering and any other sort of tabular functions you're doing in SQL.
Exactly.
Is there any way to sort of modify the data once it's being sort of pulled back from Service Manager? So can we kind of manipulate the table in Squared Up?
Not easily today. It's one of the things that we're looking at for 3.2 is to make it really easy to actually add columns, add calculated columns, and customize the look of each column. So if you want to start doing things like, for example, make it so that this created date is actually like listed as like 15 minutes ago, you can do that much easier.
Okay, cool.
Using updates we've got coming. The other thing actually you mentioned I wanted to point out was you see there's quite a lot of joins in the SQL query.
That's because, sure is.
ITSM products typically, and Service Manager is no exception, they don't store all the data for a particular like incident, say, in a single table. What you've actually got is a whole bunch of relational links. So an incident doesn't just have a field that says this is the name of the affected user. It has a link off to a user, or has a link to a related entity table. That entity table then has a user off of that. That user then has a display name table. So that's what we've got all these joins here. We've got a join to go and get the status of the change. We've got a join to go and get the display name of the status of the change. We've got a join to go and get maybe the assigned user and that kind of thing. So whenever you're doing this, be prepared with any ITSM product to start having to maybe do joins and really sort of work that schema to bring all the information you need into one place. But at the same time, do think about what you actually need. Like I've picked out 5 columns here that are useful. I could have pulled all 30 columns of incident through or change through. Do I really need them on a dashboard? So if I hit done, so that's basically it. And I could just, it's exactly the same for all these other ones. So if you open up, same connection string, just copy and paste it. And then the query, it's just a pertinent query here for incidents. It's actually almost exactly the same as the previous query, just that I'm querying from the incident view instead of querying from the change view.
Great. I'm going to fire a couple of more questions that I think maybe listeners may have. One is, you said how we can put this into table data and the sort of scalar, the big number. Can we push this into graphs and other visualizations right now?
Not yet. No. At the moment, it is just literally tabular and scalar data.
Okay.
It's something that we're looking at, but we haven't at the moment really sort of nailed down how that's going to sort of look and function. But it's something that's definitely on our mind. And actually, you just raised a good point when it comes to scalars. How it needs to work is your query should return like the
a number
count. Yeah. So here it's select count star as total from the incident table, that kind of thing. So, and again, you need to have all the columns. So if you use the same query over here that you use for open incidents, just remove all the selects and all the joins because you don't need them. So make sure that it returns a number, and that's what's shown in the scalar tile.
And I guess another question about really how this would be used by users in the real world. They would see this dashboard, that's great, alongside all their SCOM data. Can they drill down or interact with this data? So you see an incident there, can I click on that and then view that incident?
That's a great question. It's another one of those things that people have asked for it, and it's actually implemented and done, and it will be in the next version of the product.
Yay!
It's one of those great things like internally, we're like, oh, you can click on it. Actually, no, we haven't released that yet. So
great.
It's something you can do, yeah.
Good. Excellent.
So I kind of talked about sort of Service Manager. I kind of stepped a little bit over. I've mentioned a couple of times I've got 2 different databases. But one of the really important things I wanted to touch on is which database you choose to use to access this data. And again, this is somewhat relevant to other products as well. We actually have, I'm going to jump back to slides for a second. We actually have 2 different databases. We have the CMDB database, which is actually the one that Service Manager, the product, uses to power its console and perform a lot of its queries and its workflows. Now that's live data, right? That's up to the minute and very fresh. It's not designed or supported for direct reporting. So it's optimized for read-write. If you're causing a performance impact there for the extra queries you're inserting, that's going to now impact console performance, which is going to annoy people who are actually working with Service Manager. And it doesn't necessarily groom for the same duration as well. So if you start doing very long queries that show me like, the last year's worth of stuff, you're not going to see it. Conversely, we have the data warehouse, which is called DW Data Mart by default. Now that is designed and supported for long-term reporting. The data there is normalized, so it's very easy to report against it. Like if you report against the CMDB database, all the columns have got like GUIDs in the name and things because they're being dynamically generated, whereas in the data warehouse it's all nicely normalized into very simple and easy views, so it's really easy to actually report against it. But there's an ETL process on it. So for Service Manager, that data is 5 to 60 minutes stale because that's how often it takes for the ETL job to run. So backing this up into a practical example, if you're trying to show like the number of incidents in the last 3 months, having that number be 5 to 60 minutes out, probably not that relevant. If you're trying to show like currently open incidents or things that have changed in the last last 60 minutes, that's not going to be correct if you're going against the data warehouse. So you kind of need to decide, okay, what's my use case here? You know, can I put everything into the data mart and accept the slight delay and the slight sort of inaccurate data, or does it have to be fresh? But now I'm really on my own because it's not supported directly, and potentially, that my queries could break at a future point if there's an upgrade that changes the the database schema because it's not as static.
So this is similar to SCOM with the sort of ops DB versus the data warehouse, but that is actually where they differ, is the delay in the data warehouse data.
Yeah, because the data warehouse in SCOM doesn't have an ETL process. Like when a performance collection rule or an alert rule is written, it's simultaneously written to both. Service Manager doesn't have that concept. There's an ETL process going on instead.
ETL.
So extract, transform, load. So every 60 minutes, the data warehouse pulls data in from the CMDB database, normalizes it, and then puts it for long-term storage. So that's why it can get out of date. So yeah, this is sort of applicable to other products as well. Always be careful when you're looking at tables of views. How are they actually supported by the vendor? Am I allowed to query these things? And what information is actually visible? The other thing I should point out here, it doesn't really affect the queries we've got, but it is important to note. The data warehouse for Service Manager doesn't store everything by default. To try and make it actually compact, because it's storing data for so much longer than the CMDB. I'll give you a classic example. Email addresses for users aren't stored in the data warehouse by default. You can make it do it, but you've got to go and tell the data warehouse that you specifically want to store this field and any changes to it for 400 days. So that might catch you out if you're looking to write a query and actually that's not available.
Great.
Okay, so we said there's some sample queries, so I'm going to show you a few more queries now and kind of tease the content that we're going to be doing next week. So we've published on GitHub, and there's the link there, and it'll be in the show notes too, some sample queries that do show you getting sort of built-in work item and CI properties. If you've extended your change request class or your incident classes or your CI classes with extra fields, they're not going to be included in these queries and mentioned. So you're going to have to do the work there to go and actually bring those into your environment and figure out what's useful to you. So I've actually configured a perspective. And if you aren't really familiar with perspectives, I definitely recommend you go back and watch last week's coffee break.
So yeah, last week we looked at how to build perspectives and sort of conceptually what perspectives are, because we wanted to be able to sort of cover topics in this week's webinar, where really we're now putting that into action. So last week with the perspective webinar, we looked at adding in SCOM data. So taking the SCOM data for an object and putting it into a custom dashboard, custom perspective and sort of view for that object. Now we're doing the same thing, but just in the same way as top level dashboards, we can consume non-SCOM data. We can also consume non-SCOM data in a drill down in the context of a server or an application.
Right, so in this case here, we've gone to this, it's just a web server. We've come to that here, click on the Service Manager perspective, which I've configured. And now, not only do I have my SCOM data on the bottom, you can see the health of applications. So that's our SCOM data. So these are all the apps that this particular server is part of, all the services. You can also actually see now for this particular server, its open incidents, its recent changes, the recent incidents have been logged against it. And at the top here, we've got properties like CMDB properties for this particular asset. So this isn't work item stuff. This is like CMDB data that typically probably isn't inside SCOM, especially when it comes to things like who owns it or what the asset lifecycle or the warranty is. That's information you don't really want inside Operations Manager, sort of cluttering up its database, but is perfect inside your Service Management ITSM product. So we can see this server is in a particular OU. We know the custodian for it now, so if there's a problem with it, we need to contact someone. We know who we can contact. We can see whether it's currently actually deployed live or is it pending, it's currently in a staging environment, or maybe it's being retired. and if there's any particular notes on this. So when we look at this now, we can understand the context of how it's being used a bit better, and also what's going on with this server. What's the current outstanding faults, what's pending changes that are coming up, that kind of thing. So we'll talk about the actual queries that power this in our next week's coffee break session. They are available online, so if you're feeling intrepid, go and grab those now and start having a play.
Well, if you combine what you've just showed us with the dashboarding with last week's webinar on perspectives, then you might be able to find your way or guess how they're built. But yeah, we'll take a look at those next week. So really this takes it beyond just dashboarding across SCOM and Service Manager, but this is really now integration at a kind of workflow kind of level. So day-to-day operations, you're managing an application, you're managing a server. You see that data right alongside your SCOM data, and of course, I guess data from any other SQL database or web source as well.
And just as a further quick tease before we sort of wrap up, you can also do this at any level. So much like perspectives we talked about last week, can be on service, but can be on any component. If you have gone through the effort in Service Manager to configure business services and built out your portfolio as ITSM would direct you to do, we can also start doing that at sort of a service level in SCOM here too. So now I'm looking at my sales app, inside Operations Manager. We've got our availability and sort of response times and metrics and everything else, but I can also now go and see what's happening with this app. Here's all the incidents related to this app. Here's the contacts that you should contact in case of an outage and how they use it, the availability schedule. So perhaps there's a minor issue on this box. I need to take it down to fix that minor issue. Well, okay, actually, does the app owner want me to do that? Who is the app owner and what's the availability schedule? Well, I can see from this app immediately now, it is red, but it has a 24/7 availability schedule. And it's a critical app on sales and marketing. So probably, if it's only a minor issue, they'd rather I didn't take it down in the middle of the day to fix this. And I can contact them now. I know exactly who I can talk to. There's 3 different people I can talk to. And this is all coming from the CMDB and is probably already configured if you've actually really embraced that whole ITSM piece into your environment.
All right. I think there's loads more to cover, I guess. Again, probably just sort of anticipating some questions from listeners. This is integrating the data, into the views. You have planned some webinar to cover integration in terms of linking through to, say, a web front end on Service Manager as well, right? So what sort of things will we be covering in next week's webinar?
So we also have things, in addition to like how we configure these perspectives and sort of how we get this to work, we're going to look at doing stuff like actually raising incidents from Squared Up. So you click a button and it takes you to the incident portal where you can now start configuring that.
Look forward to it. Okay.
Should be good. So let's do a wrap up. So hopefully you've been following along with this coffee break series. If you haven't yet done our topic survey, please go and provide that feedback. Take a look at it. It only takes about 10 minutes and you can suggest topics that we may have missed off or vote for your favorite topics and make sure we cover those. You can see what's coming up next in the schedule as well on our Coffee Breaks microsite, and there's a registration form there for anyone or your colleagues who may want to join along and start viewing this content. All the recordings and slides from this session and every session are published via the blog, which will include the links to the queries I've published there as well, and things like the Service Manager documentation. So if you're interested in now following up with this, it's great to go and check that out and get that content. Typically it's done sort of 24 hours after the session goes live. And then there's a YouTube playlist as well for this series, which is now growing. So if you have missed some previous episodes, go and check that out. Especially the Perspectives one last week should be really good viewing.
Great. All right. So we'll wrap up there. This is a live webinar, so we'll leave it open for Q&A if anyone on the webinar wants to kind of ask any questions live. Matthew and I are here to answer those, and we've also got other members of the tech team online to answer any questions you have. So please do use this opportunity. Otherwise, hope to see you all again next week or a future coffee break series. Thanks very much, Matthew.
Thanks, Rich. Bye.